Right, good morning. Hope everybody is well. We're about to start a brand new topic, a brand new text. So that in itself is exciting on the one hand. On the other hand, we're starting off today on quite a dampened mood, I must say, having heard this morning of the passing of one of the stalwarts of this year. So I'd like to dedicate today's learning in her merit and memory, the late Salma Bacha. And Mitzvah Hashem should be a tremendous merit for her. So what we're going to do for the next couple of weeks is we're going to learn something related to the time of Moshiach. It's textual. It's based on the Rambam. So basically at the end of the Rambam, after 14 volumes of Jewish law, the very last section that he deals with is the section about the laws of kings. And that then takes him to the law of the ultimate Jewish king, which is Moshiach. And as a result of that, we examine very interesting concepts from an halachic perspective about the time of Moshiach. Now, I'm emphasizing from an halachic perspective because what we're going to discuss over the next few weeks, you may think, one second, where's the halachic element of this? This actually seems like it's a little bit more midrashic. So effectively, our theme is this. When Moshiach comes, because it's a fundamental belief that we have as Jewish people, we believe in the coming of Moshiach. So when Moshiach comes, what's going to happen? Is life going to be radically revolutionized? In which case everybody should be very nervous because everything that is familiar is going to change. Or is it going to be somehow relatable and somehow similar to life as we know it? What exactly is going to happen in the time of Moshiach? So we'll start our conversation by looking at some of the things that the Rambam says, again, from an halachic perspective. And then once we do that, we start unpacking and saying, well, surely it can't be as straightforward as what the Rambam's telling us because we have other sources that appear to say things a little bit differently. And that's where that's where things are going to start to get interesting. So it's a textual analysis of the Rambam. It's a very different style to what we just previously learned. Previously, we learned a mimer. A mimer is very spiritual in orientation. It takes a concept and develops it, taking layer by layer of a spiritual idea. Whereas over here, what we're going to do is going to be more in the style of pilpul. So for those people who are not familiar, pilpul is where you present a particular idea, and then you debate it and say, hang on a second, is that accurate? But what about this source? And how do you reconcile it with that source? And slowly we create a construction, and that construction gives us the big picture and the perspective that we should have. So let's start. What's nice about the layout in this particular text that I'm using is that he gives a summary at the top of each section, which is going to be very useful as we go along, just in terms of review. Beperek Hasim Shel Hilches Melachim Omer HaRambam, in the final chapter of the Laws of Kings, in the 14th of 14 volumes of the Rambam's Mishnah Torah, the Rambam says as follows: Al yale al halev, let it not come to mind. In other words, don't even entertain the thought. Should be Moisa Moshiach, that in the time of Moshiach, yivatel davar miminoga shalolam. Don't think that in the time of Moshiach, anything from the ordinary conduct of the world is going to stop. So if anybody thinks that when Moshiach comes, the sun is going to rise in the west, if anybody thinks that when Moshiach comes, there's no longer going to be rain, if anybody thinks that when Moshiach comes, you're not going to have money and you're not going to have to buy your groceries, even though perhaps you can now go to the new Amazon stores where you don't even have to carry money and it just automatically checks you out. The minute you take an item, it charges you automatically. But nothing about the world as we know it is going to stop when Moshiach comes. Or for that matter, the Rambam says, don't think that there'll be anything new in Maaseh Bereishis, the functioning of creation. Elo oilam keminhagoi noyeg. Instead, it says very clearly that what's going to happen, it's going to be the world as we know it. Oilam keminhagoi noyeg. The world is going to continue as we know it. Now, of course, you're going to say, well, then what's the big deal about Mashiach? Who needs it? The world as it is today seems to have so much trouble and sadness and pain and conflict. So you're telling me the world is going to continue? Okay, so the obvious implication over here is that anything unhealthy, toxic, inappropriate, that will be removed from the world. But what the Rambam's talking about over here is day-to-day life. So will there be war? No, the Rambam says that clearly. Will there be jealousy and competition? No, the Rambam says that clearly. Will there be illness? No, the Rambam says that clearly. But in terms of day-to-day conduct, the world goes on as is. So you're still going to go to the shops, and you're still going to have coffee with your friends, and you're still going to drive a car, or whatever particular mode of transport becomes available due to technology. That's what's going to be. Says the Rambam, you're going to attack me immediately and say, what do you mean? There are clear verses in the Torah that speak of a miraculous reality that is totally different to the world of nature. So I'm saying that nothing's going to change, but if you read scriptures, everything's going to change. So the fact that it says in the book of Yeshaya, V'gor ze'ev. So what's V'gor ze'ev? It's not the full quotation. The full quotation, as we read on the Haftarah on the last day of Pesach, says that the wolf will lie with the lamb, and the lion will eat hay like an ox. So is that not going to change? Is that not a change? Vegetarian lions sounds like a major change in minhag ha'olam, in the way that the world operates. The idea of a peaceful wolf hanging out in the middle of the pasture with all the sheep sounds like a radical change. So the Rambam says, you're going to question me. You're going to say, I'm telling you nothing's going to change. And then you read these sources and they say that everything's going to change. So he explains that they are moshel vechida. These psukim, these verses in the Torah, are not to be taken literally. They are all metaphoric and they are all representative of ideas. What are the ideas? For example, when it speaks about the wolf lying peacefully with the lamb, it's actually describing how the Jewish people are going to be at peace with the idolatrous nations of the world. So we know very famously that the Jewish people are called kifsa achas bein shivim ze'evim, that we're compared to one lamb surrounded by 70 wolves. Obviously, the implication being that the nations around us don't like us too much, and they'd be happy to savagely attack us, as our history has proven, and we're like this sheep, this victim. So when the Torah tells us in the prophecies of Yeshaya that in the future the wolf and the lamb will lie together peacefully, it means that what's going to happen is we'll be in peace. Because one thing is clear, both from the Rambam and as we're shortly going to see from the Gemara, that the one thing that will change when Moshiach comes is there will no longer be persecution of the Jewish nation. That will change. So it means sheyusol yoshim levetach emrishay akum hameshulim ki ze'ev v'nomer shenemar ze'ev, etc. He brings the various psukim to illustrate to us that the nations of the world are compared to these hungry, bloodthirsty wolves. How will that happen? Now, if you're saying that the world doesn't change in any remarkable, miraculous way, so how does this peace emerge? What causes it? So he explains, V'yachzuru kulam ledaso emes. What's going to change is their perspective. Now we have a world, and that's why he uses the word akum. Now we have a world of people who serve other gods, and they have other value systems. They reject Hashem, they reject Torah, they reject truth, and as a result of that, they behave in a way that's inappropriate. But if we could get those people, if they come back to acknowledge and accept truth that there's one God, truth that you may not murder, truth that you may not steal, so that's not an unnatural world, that's an educated world, that's an enlightened world. So therefore, people will no longer steal. Therefore, people will no longer destroy things. Not because somebody came with a magic wand and changed them, but because suddenly their eyes are opened and everybody is enlightened. And of course, as the prophet Yeshaya himself says in that particular set of prophecies, he says what will happen is the world will be filled with the knowledge of Hashem like the ocean covers the seabed. So the implication over here is when there is knowledge, when there is wisdom about Hashem, naturally people behave differently. I guess it's not entirely different to when you have a class filled with children who are completely unruly, and the next thing they notice that the principal is standing at the door. That's not a miracle, that they suddenly all get back to their seats and they sit quietly. That's a realization. Oops, didn't realize that we were being watched by the authorities. So what's going to happen when Hashem reveals himself in the time of Moshiach? It's not a miracle that now people get their brains rewired and suddenly anti-Semites become friends. There's a realization. Whoops, I suddenly recognize these are Hashem's chosen people, the apple of his eye. How could I possibly do anything else but to show them the greatest respect? How could I steal something from another person? It's absolutely clear to me that Hashem has allocated that to this person and he's allocated something else to me. So why would I take what's not mine? And not only that, they will eat only that which is permissible to eat. And that does not necessarily mean that the nations of the world will keep kosher. It just means that they'll only partake of the things that they're allowed to partake of. So, for example, in the 7 Narcheid laws, a non-Jewish person is not allowed to eat from a living animal, any part of a living animal. It's part of the 7 Narcheid laws. Now, you may say that doesn't really happen much in today's world, right? When last did you go to a restaurant and they kind of lobbed off the limb of an animal and served it? But the extension of that is that there are certain dietary practices, culinary practices, of taking living creatures, for example, and chucking them into boiling water in order to serve them to the guests, that would not be permitted according to the Torah. So what's going to happen when Moshiach comes is that the nations of the world, they'll have their eyes open and they'll recognize we cannot behave that way. Etc. That's the pasuk that says that the lion will eat like an ox will eat. Not that lions in the Kruger National Park are going to become vegetarians suddenly. It means that the lions, the nations of the world and various nations are compared to lions. For example, the Babylonians were compared to a lion. As the famous Medrash tells us about Tisha B'Av, it says, Ola Aryeh b'mazal Aryeh v'hechiv Ariel, that the lion is going to rise up, that referring to the Babylonians, during the month that is represented by the star sign of Leo, and will destroy the Beis HaMikdash, which is shaped and constructed to look like a lion. So a lion is often used as a symbolism of the nations of the world. So what does it mean that the lions will eat hay like an ox? It means that they will eat what is appropriate to eat from this world, like the Jewish people eat what is appropriate to eat. And says the Rambam, the Rambam summarizes it very clearly that likewise any of these very radical suggestions of what's going to change in our world when Moshiach comes are all metaphoric. So if you have any questions as to how the Rambam perceives the time of Moshiach, he's made it absolutely clear to us. The time of Moshiach is a world as we know it, without persecution, without conflict, and with no major miracles. Not only that, but he says when Moshiach comes, then when Moshiach comes, then it will become appropriate or become available. We'll be able to tell, now I know what that verse was really referring to. Now I understand what that particular mashal is about. So the Rambam is very clear that the Messianic age is not a flipping of nature on its head. And then he continues. The Rambam doesn't stop at that point, but he quotes the Gemara, where he says that our sages said in the Gemara, that there's no difference between our current world reality and the reality of the time of Moshiach, except for the persecution of the Jewish people at the hands of other nations. So it's really clear. It's really clear what the Rambam's perspective is. Okay, so let's explore this. And that's where things are going to get interesting, right, as we begin to explore this further. So we start to say, hey, hang on a second. Firstly, does the Rambam dovetail with other commentaries? How does the Rambam tackle what would appear to be very clear evidence of things that are going to change in the time of Moshiach? That's going to be our journey. So, Ledasa Rambam Anal, going with this opinion that the Rambam has proposed, that that nothing of the ordinary conduct of our world will suspend when Mashiach comes, but rather that the world will continue as normal. It would appear that there are quite a number of sources that contradict what the Rambam has just said. And our job is to explore those sources. Now, by way of introduction, I think it's very important to remember this. Sometimes you listen to people who learn Gemara, and it can be quite scary or off-putting to listen to them, because they come out and they say, oh, we learned this Gemara, and there was such a beautiful, strong question. Right? Or somebody put forward an idea in their shir that they were giving, and we were able to undermine their proposal because we had a strong svara, a strong logical debate with what they had to say. So what's wrong with that is that people come out of this thinking that the ultimate goal of Judaism is debate and questions, which isn't true. Because Torah is Hashem's wisdom, and therefore Torah has to be absolutely harmonious. And so the ultimate goal of Torah is to bring harmony between what appear to be disparate opinions. So, if I have the Rambam saying something, and now I'm going to find other sources within Torah that appear to say differently to the Rambam, then the first thing I need to ask myself is, how do I reconcile those opinions? It's far too easy to just say, there's a debate between different sources. I don't want debate. Judaism is about harmony, not conflict. Hashem Echad. The whole purpose of Judaism is to bring things into oneness. So let's have a look at these different sources that appear to contradict the Rambam, and then try and reconcile them. So we're going to start with one. Umeihen. Hamaymer b'toras kohanim b'parasha seinu ala pasuk ve'eit hasode yitain period. What's nice about this is that we're actually starting this journey in the correct week. It's in the parasha we're going to read this week, Parashas B'chukoisai. And Parashas B'chukoisai says that one of Hashem's promises to us says that if you do what I say, if you follow my statutes, if you commit yourself to learning Torah with great investment, then Hashem says one of the promises is Eitz hasode yitain period. The trees of the field will produce fruit. Now, there's a commentary which is on the entire book of Vayikra. It's a midrash called the Toras Kohanim. For those people familiar, there are various midrashim, and the various midrashim have various names. But there's one series of midrashim where each book of the Chumash is named differently. So Toras Kohanim is the part of the midrash that deals only with Vayikra, which is, of course, the laws of sacrifices. That's why it's called the Torah of the Kohanim. They're the ones responsible to bring the sacrifices. So in Toras Kohanim, commenting on this promise where Hashem says that the Eitz Hasode Yiten Period, that now if you want to read it, you could read it in two ways. Simply, Eitz Hasode, the trees of the field will give fruit, or you could read it as Eitz Hasodeh, the wood of the field will produce fruit. So the Midrash over there goes into a very interesting conversation and makes this comment. Ominayin she'afi lonei sarak asidim liyois oisim peiros. How do I know that when Moshiach comes, even trees that are not currently fruit-bearing, when Moshiach comes, will begin to bear fruit? So I don't know what you've got in your garden, but the likelihood is that most of the trees in your garden are not fruit trees. And here the Midrash suggests that when Moshiach comes, they'll all be fruit trees. In other words, implying that there are going to be a whole range of fruits that we've never heard of before, that are suddenly going to become available when Moshiach comes. Talmud Loimar, how do we know that such a thing will happen? Because the Torah says in this parasha, Ve'etz hasodeh yiten period, that the trees of the field will give forth fruit. It does not say the trees of an orchard, which is basically fruit trees. It says the trees of the field, all manner of trees, the whole lot of trees are all going to produce fruit when Moshiach comes. Now, I think everybody will agree that that is something which is unnatural. It's completely unnatural for a tree that is not designed, that hasn't for 5,781 years ever produced fruit, now to suddenly produce fruit. So the Rambam tells us that when Moshiach comes, nothing supernatural is going to happen, and nothing about the process of how the world operates is going to change. Now he says, not the Rambam, but the Midrash, that when Moshiach comes, all trees will produce fruit. That contradicts surely to what the Rambam said, because that surely is something unnatural. Bedoime lekach. Similarly, now there's a reason why we're bringing a second source to the same point, because if you pay close attention, you'll see that the wording of the Midrash and the wording of the Gemara are going to be slightly different, and that's going to be part of our discussion and our exploration over here. So, B'doime lekach, similarly, Nema b'soif Maseches Ksubas, on the second last page of the Gemara Ksubas, which is the largest single, one of the largest single Gemaras in the in Shas. So all the way at the end over there, page 112, Amud Aleph, the first part of the page, it says, Omer Rav Chia bar Ashi Omer Rav. Rav Chia bar Ashi quotes Rav, who was one of the leading sages in the early period of the Gemara. Asidim kol ilonei sorak sheberetz Yisrael sheitanu peiros. He predicts that in the future, when Mashiach comes, every single tree in Israel, fruit-bearing or not, will produce fruit. Shenemar, and he brings a different pasuk. What's the pasuk? So he brings the pasuk, Ki eitz nasa piryoi te'ena v'gefen nasnu chelam. The pasuk says that a tree will carry its fruits, and figs and grapes will give their strength. In other words, implying that there are certain fruit trees that always have produced fruits, they will be stronger. And then there are other trees that now, for the first time, will carry fruits. So both from the perspective of the Medrash and from the perspective of the Gemara, they both seem to describe a situation where the nature of the world changes. How would the Rambam defend his opinion against those two sources? Because both of those are earlier sources, they're primary sources. The Rambam does not have authority just to dismiss them out of hand. So if the Rambam makes a statement, he has to explain how his statement will still make sense in light of those sources. So what do we got? The Rambam says the world's not going to change in any radical way when Moshiach comes. The Midrash and the Gemara say, well, here's how it's going to change. Suddenly there are going to be fruit trees everywhere. So the first suggestion that we're going to offer is, well, what was the Rambam's thinking? The Rambam says that the verses that appear to describe a radical change in the world are all metaphoric. So maybe the Rambam feels the same way about this Medrash and about the Gemara. Maybe the Rambam will argue that the Medrash and the Gemara are also metaphoric. So let's explore that as a possibility. Like I said in the beginning, this is the style of Pilpul. So you make a comment, you raise a question against the comment, now you try to rebut the question. So maybe we could have answered, according to the Rambam's view, the Rambam also believes that these statements of our sages are metaphoric. Okay, so you can't just say that as a broad statement. You're going to have to explain it. How could trees that had never borne fruit now start to bear fruit? How could that be a mashal, a metaphor? So let's see. We know that the principle, the concept of a tree that produces fruit is something that is used by our sages in the Gemara to describe a Torah scholar. So, for example, when the Torah tells us in Parshas Shoftim, where it tells us that you are not allowed to cut down a fruit tree. So if you look at the context of it, the context is that when you go to war and you lay siege to your enemies, and you might need to cut down trees because you'll need materials or because you want to thin out the protection maybe that they have from those trees. So the Torah says very clearly that if it's if it's a fruit-bearing tree, then you may not cut it down. And it says something interesting. It says, Ki mimenu soichel voisoi loi sichrois. You may eat from that tree, and therefore you may not cut down that tree. Then the Torah says, but if it's a tree which does not provide any fruit, then the Torah says, oisoi sashchis v'charata. That tree you can destroy and you can cut down. So the Gemara takes those two psukim, which are juxtaposed, right? Because the Torah says, if it produces fruit, then you eat from it and you don't destroy it. If it does not produce fruit, then you can destroy it and cut it down. Says the Gemara, what is this Torah, what is this teaching us? Besides the fact that in a war setting, and by extension in a peaceful setting for sure, you may not cut down a fruit tree. Says the Gemara, the language is elaborate. It didn't have to give us so much information. If it is fruit bearing, then you may eat from it and not cut it down. Just say straight, don't cut fruit trees. Yes, cut other trees. Says the Gemara, it's telling us about two kinds of people. The tree that produces fruit is a Talmid Chacham, a Torah scholar. Mimenu toichel. You should eat what he provides. In other words, the Torah is giving us good advice. It's saying, if somebody is a Torah scholar, make sure to benefit from their wisdom. Just like fruit is not just food, but it is enjoyable because it's sweet. So the teachings of a Talmid Chacham are not only informative, but they enrich your life. And therefore be careful, loy sichrois. Don't in any way harm that Torah scholar. But if there's a person who does not provide fruit, then says the Gemara, that is a person who is ignorant, that is a person who doesn't add value to the world. That's somebody you should excise out of your life. You don't need their meaningless, ignorant perspective to start to color your views. Cut them out of your life. So it's very clear from our sages that the terms fruit tree and non-fruit tree are metaphoric. One refers to Talmidei Chachamim, ve'ilonei sarok, and those trees that do not produce fruits, hakavana le'amei haaretz, those refer to ignorant people. So if that's the case, why doesn't the Rambam just say very simply that the prediction both of the Medrash and of the Gemara is as follows? In the future, when Moshiach comes, even those individuals who in today's world are absolutely ignorant, they are people of the earth. In the time of Moshiach, they'll also produce fruit. Meaning to say, they'll change. Their eyes will also be opened, much like we said about the nations of the world, that their eyes will be opened and they'll realize that they have to behave in a nice way. So the eyes of the ignorant will be open and they'll realize that they have to learn Torah and they'll also become Torah scholars. So that's it. We can now reconcile the Rambam with the Gemara and the Medrash. The Rambam's view remains the same, that no major spiritual or supernatural things are going to happen when Moshiach comes. It's just that there are metaphoric illustrations used to describe things that are going to happen at that time. And if you don't like that particular explanation, then surely if you did a bit of research, you would find another interpretation of what the symbolism of a fruit tree and a non-fruit tree would be, and it could remain perfectly metaphoric. Okay, so how did we start? We started by the Rambam making a very powerful statement that in the time of Moshiach, don't expect all kinds of supernatural miracles, because that's not going to happen. The world is going to be exactly as we know it, except for the enlightenment of its inhabitants. And now we ask the question, yes, but there's a Medrash and a Gemara that both say miraculous things will occur in the time of Moshiach. So we'll say, you're right, but they're actually not miraculous. They're actually just descriptions of things that will happen in the time of Mashiach to people, just like the description of the lion and of the wolf and the lamb was a description of people. The description of these two types of trees is a description of people. But we're not going to accept that as our answer, as beautiful as it sounds. Like I said, this is the style of Pilpul. Just when you think that you've reached a point where everything falls neatly in place, then we say, but. It's not actually a good enough explanation for two reasons. One is a minor reason, one is a major reason. Let's start with the minor reason. The first thing that makes it difficult to accept this explanation is you cannot equate the words of the rabbis in the Gemara with the words of the prophets in Tanakh. Prophecy is not always literal. That's the nature of prophecy. So many of the prophecies that are shared in Tanakh are deliberately metaphoric. Whether it's the vision that Yirmiyahu has of this great iron cast pot, whether it is the vision that Moshe Rabbeinu has at the splitting of the sea, that Hashem is Ish Milchama, a man of war, whether it is the vision that Yecheskel has of a chariot in heaven, we understand that these things are not literal. They are metaphoric. It's the language of prophecy. But when you're dealing with the Medrash and the Mishnah and the Gemara, their language is never intended to be metaphoric. This is a part of Judaism that helps to decode what the Torah says, not encode things in new metaphors. So, sorry, but it is a little bit far-fetched to assume that the rabbis of the Medrash and the rabbis of the Gemara meant that the trees are not literal trees. That's our first problem with this suggestion. Our second problem is you can never look at things in isolation. You always have to look at them in context. It's especially difficult in this scenario to believe that the trees that the rabbis are talking about are not actually trees, they're people. Key. Why? Because we've got to look at context. Let's remember where the Medrash is commenting. The Medrash is commenting on our parsha. Our parsha is about Hashem's promise of what will happen to you physically if you do what he says. So the Medrash goes through a list of real, tangible, physical blessings that are going to happen to us when we observe Torah and mitzvahs. Uveinehem gam pirsha bracha shenemre bepasuk v'nosna haaretz yivula ve'etz hasadeh yitein piryoi. It's in that context describing tangible, physical blessings that are going to happen when we listen to Hashem. In that context, the Midrash now says, and so too the pasuk of how the land will produce its yield and the trees of the field will give forth fruit. Says the Midrash, that it's not going to be as it is currently. So when the Torah says that the land is going to produce its yield, the Midrash says, what does it mean produce its yield? Not as it does now. How do things work now? Well, we're not farmers, so perhaps we're not so familiar with this. But if you've had a vegetable patch in your garden, or if you just know a little bit about how the world works, we know that you plant something and then you wait. And depending on what particular thing you've planted will determine how long you have to wait. And during that waiting period, you have to make sure that you water the particular thing that it should grow. And you have to make sure that it is safe from pests that might come and destroy it. So there are quite a number of things that you have to be aware of over a lengthy period of time in order to guarantee that you will have yield from what you plant. That's not how it used to be. You remember that after the Chet Eitz Hadas, after the tree of knowledge, one of the things that Hashem declared as a consequence for having eaten from the forbidden fruit was the idea that it would be difficult to produce things from the ground. That you would produce bread by the sweat of your brow. And what was going to grow was going to be encased in thorns, and it was going to be like a difficult process in order to produce things out of the ground. Says the Medrash, what's going to happen if we listen to what Hashem says is we will get back to how it used to be in the time of Adam Arishon. Nizras voisoperes ben yoima. How was it in the time of Adam Arishon? Adam would plant something, and that same day it would grow and ripen. Natuav voisoperes ben yoima. And likewise, the same day that you planted a tree, it would grow to maturity and produce fruit. Now, is that a metaphor? Doesn't sound like it. Sounds like the Medrash is being very pragmatic. The Medrash is saying, the way that your field works now is not how it used to work in the time of Adam Harishon, and it's not how it will work in the future when Hashem rewards us for everything that we have done, which is effectively in the time of Moshiach. So the context of the Medrash is that it's talking about tangible, physical brachas. Oh, and then it adds another one. Remember I said that if you pay attention to the words, the pasuk says, Eitz hasadeh. You could translate that as the tree of the field, or you could translate it as Eitz, the wood of the field. And that's exactly what the Medrash says. When Moshiach comes, we will also revert to another reality that used to exist in the time of Adam Harishon, ha'etz ne'echol, that you could eat the bark of the tree. Today's world, that's unthinkable. Today's world, you have a whole tree, and out of the whole tree, there's a number of fruits that are edible, which you then remove, and then the tree stands there for months on end, adding no direct value to human consumption. When it was the time of Adam Harishon, you could eat every piece of the tree, and that's why I guess it was very useful that the tree would grow anew every single day, because it probably had to, because you could eat everything, the trunk, the bark, the leaves. So it's pretty clear, Kloimar, Shabracha hikipshuta begashmius mamash. So in addition to our first objection, which was we don't believe that the rabbis of the Talmud actually speak in riddles, we believe that they speak pragmatically. Besides that, the context of the Medrash is it's talking about physical changes that are going to happen in the world. So we have to assume that when it then says that trees which currently do not produce fruit in the time of Mashiach will produce fruit, we have to assume they mean that literally. So our attempt to want to say that the Rambam would excuse that Medrash by saying it's metaphoric doesn't seem like a good attempt. That's the Medrash. Remember, we quoted two sources. We quoted the same idea both from the Medrash Torah's Kohanim and from the Gemara in Ksubas. So we have now shown that in context, the Medrash Torah's Kohanim is clearly talking about very tangible changes that are going to happen in the Messianic age. What about the Gemara in Ksubas? Little more tricky, the Gemara in Ksubas, even though, again, the context is going to show us that we're not talking metaphors, we're talking practical things, but it's a little more tricky. If you look in the Gemara Ksubas, prior to the conversation where it says that there will be these trees suddenly producing fruit in the time of Mashiach, prior to that, the Gemara there talks about other things, not on the topic necessarily, although the second one probably is on the topic, and these are things that cannot be metaphoric. Ule Dugma, we're going to look at two of them. There's actually a series. It's a whole series of little paragraphs almost that the Gemara says about different topics leading up to this particular one. So one of them it says is Rabbi Chanina metaken miskelei chule. The Gemara tells us that Rabbi Chanina took it on himself as kind of a public service to remove or repair hazards on the road. So basically what the Torah wants us, what the Gemara wants us to know over there is that Rabbi Chanina loved Israel so much that even though he was a great sage, and it was really beneath his dignity to get down and dirty, he would go and he would remove things that were lying in the road, like stones that were lying in the road that might have hurt somebody as they were walking. He loved Israel so much, he cleared the pathways. Or, alternatively, the Gemara says, if there was like a pothole in the road, something, of course, that we don't relate to. So if there had been a pothole in the road, he would go and personally fill in the hole so that the roads of Israel would be safe. Why? Because he loved Israel so much. So do you think that that is metaphoric? Is that what it sounds like to you? I mean, the whole purpose of what the Gemara wants to illustrate to us over there is, look how much Rabbi Chanina loved the land. So if you want to illustrate how much he loved the land, then surely he must be talking about things that he actually did to the land. Or another thing that the Gemara tells us over there is that kategoria b'talmidei chachamim. It says asida lios kategoria b'talmidei chachamim. One of the things that will be a sign that we're living in the time of Moshiach is that there will be a terrible attack against the sages of Torah. What's nice about this particular version of the Sikha is that they actually translate the pieces from the Gemara too. The whole sikh is a translation from Yiddish into Hebrew, but they also translate the quotations. So, B'dor sheyavoy Moshiach yirbu hamakatrgim al hachachomim. That in the generation before Moshiach comes, what will happen is that there'll be many, many people who speak out against Torah scholars before Moshiach comes. So is that metaphoric? How could that be metaphoric? I mean, surely you would expect some kind of a poetic description to turn into a metaphor for the fact that people speak against the rabbis. But here it says clearly that they speak against the rabbis. Therefore, in both cases, both the Medrash and the Gemara, it only makes sense to us that if you look at things in context, they're actually talking about practical, physical descriptions. So what do we have? We have the Rambam towards the end of Mishnah Torah telling us that don't expect anything supernatural in the time of Moshiach. It will be the world as we know it with enlightenment of its inhabitants, and that's why they're going to behave nicely. We asked that surely there are other sources that would seem to contradict that. So far, we've only looked at two sources describing one change in the world. Don't think that we've exhausted the options. Later on, we're going to look at other sources. But the first two sources that came to mind was a Medrash and a Gemara talking about how when Mashiach comes, ordinary trees will begin to miraculously produce fruit. We thought we could get out of this by saying, well, the Rambam would read that as metaphoric, and he would say that it's actually referring to people, and that ignorant people in the time of Mashiach will suddenly have wisdom and insight. But we reject that for two reasons. Firstly, because the language of the sages is generally not metaphoric, and secondly, because both in the Medrash and in the Gemara, the context within which we're discussing this is specifically about physical, real, tangible things. So that's not a good enough explanation. Remember, our objective is to try and harmonize the Rambam with other sources, so let's try something else. So the next piece, which we'll learn only next week because it's too long for the time that we have now, but the next piece is we're going to attempt, and that's why I said that when you look at the Medrash and the Gemara, it's quite important to pay attention to the wording because the wording is very significant. We're going to suggest, oh, yes, of course there'll be miracles in the time of Moshiach, but only in the land of Israel. Maybe that's the answer. Maybe the Rambam was speaking broadly, that in the world in general there will not be supernatural experiences when Moshiach comes, and maybe the Medrash and Gemara were talking specifically about Israel, because Israel, we know, is always a special place. It's supernatural even in today's world, so you can expect that there'll be supernatural experiences in Israel in the world of Moshiach. So perhaps that's our way out. We'll see whether or not this is a compelling argument. We'll see next week. And then once we've done that, we'll have to explore some other sources that also appear to contradict what the Rambam has said and seem to propose that there are miracles in the time of Mashiach. Why are we learning this? Because I think everybody wonders, what's going to actually happen and should I be afraid of it? So this will hopefully help us to get our heads around that.